Hi, this is Paul. I still don't know the way this whole thing is going to shake out with Daily Wire and the Exodus seminar. Um, I've had some communication back and forth. They haven't given me any constant strikes for the commentaries I've put up so far. They did say that these are only going to be on the internet for a limited amount of time, and so I don't know. I don't know. And so the first one I think is going to stay up, but the other ones won't. So I don't really know what's going to happen to these. I might have to take them all down when the content disappears. I don't know if they'll let me know when the content disappears. What I don't want to get is just overnight I get 10 strikes and my channel comes down off of YouTube. So I don't exactly know what to do, so I'm thinking about other ways of doing it. I still have permission to do 10 minutes per episode, but obviously what I've done with episode 2 and already so far with episode 3 is way more than that. So I'm thinking about playing around with some other things. It's nowhere near as easy or I think as smooth as just letting it play and pausing and talking about it and bringing in other material, which is generally what I do with these things. So to pick up where we left off, Peterson is reading chapter 4, verse 5 and following. And he's reading in the King James. We can start with the NIV in verse 4. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." Moses, well, let's just start a little earlier. It's fun because I'm going through this with my men's group too. Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me?" And said, "The Lord did not appear to you." Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake. And he ran from it, which I think is just the most hilarious thing. It's a reasonable thing, but it's the most hilarious thing. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." And of course, the tail is exactly the worst place to take a snake, especially a poisonous snake. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Now, one of the interesting things about this belief is, again, we tend to think in very direct, simple, streamlined stories. And I think we're also impacted sort of by rationality and the way rationality has come to be thought of. And people don't work like this at all. Now, in the end, obviously, these signs that Moses is given will impact the people and they will come to believe. But that belief, again, our imagination is that belief is just very, very flat. And it's not at all how belief works. I've made this point with the disciples often that nobody saw Jesus do more miracles than the disciples did. And then when the chips were down and Jesus gets arrested, first they try a half-hearted effort, which Jesus stops them with violence, and then they run and hide. And it isn't until after the Holy Spirit comes that they actually act with boldness. So, and that's true here of Moses, where God gives him these rather dramatic signs, but these signs themselves don't sort of say, "Oh, okay, if you're here, God, then everything's just smooth. We're just going to Mary Jane our way through this." Or what is the name of what is the name? I don't remember the meme of the girl boss, Rey Skywalker, who just does everything perfect. That's not anything what this is like. Now, if I've got 10 minutes per episode, then I really have to sort of pick the parts that are really good, and so I'm just sort of thinking of kind of making 2 copies, and kind of segmenting the time where I run this. So I have a long version that I just run the video as I usually do in comment, and a short video where I just have very select moments that I actually want to talk about. I'm not sure exactly how this goes with my workflow because I literally spend less than a minute editing any of these videos. That's sort of the way I've streamlined my process for making videos. But let's try this.
God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hath appeared unto thee. And the Lord said furthermore unto Moses, Put now thine hand into thy bosom. and he put his hand into his bosom, like Napoleon. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was as leprous as snow. And he said, put thine hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and plucked it out. And behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. And it shall come to pass, God says, if they will not believe thee, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, the rod and the snakes, that they will believe the voice of the latter sign. And there's a...
Now Peterson goes on to read more. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand in his cloak, and when he did, he took it out, and the skin was leprous, and it became white as snow. Now, part of what I've done with this little layout, for those of you who watch my Adult Sundays class, you know I make pages like this for that, so you can look at the Hebrew and you can look at the Septuagint, that's the LXX. And in this case, I decided to use the JPS 1917, which is a Jewish translation into English, and Tanakh, which is a translation in 1985. It's often interesting comparing translations over time and looking at the different ways that the editors and the committees decided to phrase things. And you can just often see, and he said, put thy hand, you still have thys in the JPS 17, put thy hand back into thy bosom. And he put his hand back into his bosom, and then he took it out of his bosom, and behold, it turned again as his other flesh. The top one, as he put his hand in his bosom, he took it out, and it became, and behold, they have the beholds in the older translation, and behold, his hand was leprous as white as snow. In the 1985 version, his hand was encrusted with snowy scales. Another fun source, if you're reading through the Pentateuch, is Robert Alter's The Five Books of Moses. Alter has a unique translation, which he does himself, and then he often has very interesting notes. With respect to this, the Hebrew here represents blanched, as rendered as leprous in many older translations, but modern scholarly consensus is that what is involved is some disfiguring skin disease other than leprosy. Again, notice the modern preoccupation with, let's say, a physical correspondentism. So leprosy, even if sort of in many of the old translations of the Bible they would use leprosy, we don't want to do that because there's a confusion with modern leprosy, so we're just going to have a disfiguring skin disease. The comparison with snow would not refer to flaking, as some have claimed, and you can see that in the Tanakh. Because like snow is a known biblical simile for total whiteness. In the case of skin, lost all pigmentation. A skin disease will figure among the plagues which God will strike the Egyptians, and so is the second of the two metamorphic signs here. God appropriately is both sudden bringer of disease and healer.
An emphasis here on the healing capacity of divine alignment. It's something like that. And so the hero is the person who can speak the words of magic that are curative. And well, we certainly believe that in the psychotherapeutic sense. So,
well, to Oz's point yesterday, believe the voice of the latter. It's the voice of the latter, even though it's visual, right? Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also there to help you understand the first miracle. It's just two versions of the same miracle. You know, it's like moving from wholeness. So one is a vertical to the watery chaos at the bottom, snake at the bottom, Leviathan, all that. And the other one is the periphery to the center. And so it's like move out, disease, move in, find healing. And so I think that's what it's showing. It's like this relationship of the center to the periphery, and the other one is a vertical to that which is at the bottom.
Jonathan's comment there is interesting. I'm not quite sure. I understand exactly what he's saying, but I don't understand where it really works into the story. Now, clearly, Jonathan basically says that it's the staff to it goes basically order to chaos, that Moses is the master of the transformation of order to chaos, and that does make sense. That's sort of implicit in miracle workers, but not always, and the same with in and out. thinking about this again, thinking about death and wholeness, that Moses, deep beneath, these aren't just magic tricks. And later, of course, you'll get to the hilarious part where all the water is turned to blood, and so the magicians take what little water they have and turn it to blood too. And someone might say, no, if you were actually good court magicians, you would turn the water that Moses turned to blood back to water. That's what would be the correct thing to do. Then you would show yourself as instruments of Pharaoh, who's the giver of life in Egypt. So, in second thinking about Jonathan's point, I very much see his point.
And if it shall come to pass, if they will not believe also these two signs, neither hearken unto thy voice, that thou shalt take of the water of the river and pour it upon the dry land. So there's more of his mastery of water there. And the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or deaf or the seeing or the blind? Am I not the Lord? It's actually, have I not the Lord? Now, therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in his mouth. And I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people. And he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. And so now we have this building.
So now we have the water to blood, and then we have Moses' objection. And it's interesting when you look at the objections, they're all worded differently. I am slow of speech and tongue. I am slow of speech and tongue. Robert Alter notes with respect to the water, Nile becoming blood. Thus, the enactment of this third sign coincides with the implementation of the first plague. If the metamorphosis of Moses' own staff and hand do not convince the Egyptians, and the spectacular transformation of the Nile, an Egyptian deity, as Rashi notes, in the very source of life in Egypt, will eliminate any lingering skepticism. It's the source of life, it's the source of wealth, it's the source of power. The Nile is the source of Egypt. The predominance of blood in the entire narrative should be observed. Moses already spilled Egyptian blood. The phrase is not used, but it is a fixed biblical idiom for manslaughter and murder. The 10 plagues will begin with a plague of blood and end with one in which blood is heavily involved. In the way to Egypt, verse 24 to 26, Moses' life is spared by a rite carried out through blood. The story of liberation from Egyptian bondage is imagined as a process of violent oppression to be broken only by violent counterstrokes. The portent then seems to be to turn the Nile water into blood. Then it is scooped up and scattered on dry land. In the event, a more cataclysmic turning of the water of the river into its channel of blood will take place. Dry land and water prefigure the Sea of Reeds miracle. Now the heavy-mouthed, and it seems futile to speculate, as so many commentators do, whether Moses suffered from an actual speech impediment or merely unaccustomed to public speaking. The point is that he invokes these Hebrew idioms for impeded speech. Whether as hyperbole or physiological fact scarcely matters. To express his feeling of incapacity for the mission, which is the new reason for refusal that God has settled the question of skepticism of Israelites. In the subsequent narrative, Moses actually appears to be capable of considerable eloquence.
Of an intermediary structure. Jonathan, you've maybe got some things to say about that.
I think that this is the beginning of this idea of the importance of the intermediary structure, but not just importance, but also the manner in which God will fill the world is through something like that. And so it's really radical what he's actually saying. He's saying, he's like, I'm going to set up a structure in which you're going to be God to Aaron, and I'm going to be God to you. And so it's going to be like this hierarchy of sub-gods, and you'll see this. So this is just the first example of it. But then as the text continues, there'll be all these different iterations of this intermediary structure, whether it is the structure of authority that his wife's father is suggesting, and then whether it be the law itself. The law is these mediations.
Jonathan, why do you think that first mediation or the first appointed sub-god has to do with him being, right? Because it's just as easy for God to say, I will make thee speak clearly.
Yeah.
Why is the first choice somebody who can speak for him? Is it that proximity to God requires a sort of inarticulateness, that the closeness to God means it can't be conveyed as clearly, and thus the need for...
I never thought about that. That's actually a very interesting idea.
Because Moses is someone who, by the nature of his experience, can be inspired by God, but he can't translate it into language.
Wait a minute, if you speak articulately, you're not close to God?
Well, I think it's... I think it's a first step.
Well, in light of that...
But isn't there something very striking here that we're told that he says, I'm not eloquent, and yet, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we read that, and there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom God knew face to face. Now, so this idea that Moses is the prophet par excellence, and yet we're told, he says, I'm not good with words. I mean,
now, in the earlier videos, I see a lot of development of Moses in this. And I think in many ways it is parallel to the patriarchs, that God begins a relationship with Abraham, and Abraham doesn't start out with faith. In fact, all the patriarchs, God begins a relationship with them, and they do terrible things, and bit by bit by bit, their faith grows, and they become the men, the tools that God is going to use. And I think that is what is going on with Moses. You see that God has his hand on Moses right from the start, and he's developing Moses into who he wants him to be, a tool that is capable for accomplishing what God wants him to become. And I think that's very much what this is about. And the observation that at the end of Moses' life, when you go all the way to the book of Deuteronomy, that it speaks so highly of Moses, is because God, in a sense, God sort of signals that when he's talking to Moses, because he says, I made your mouth. And well, what he is doing in all of this is he's making his mouth. Now, Greg had asked the interesting question about, is it true that the person close to God can't be eloquent? And Dennis Prager sort of laughed, and they talked about this as a joke. But again, I see this as a part of the development, which is the same development that you see in the patriarchs. If you to read the book of Exodus, you really have to know the book of Genesis and see the patterns in Genesis, because they're very much carried through in Exodus.
Well, it means you can be good without being able to think verbally. That's part of it.
well,
Clearly he grew.
well, there's the
there's
seeing
that
face to
too.
face, of
But
course.
there's a
That's
narrative trope
interesting.
of the blind prophet. There's many narrative tropes like that where you'll have someone who's deficient in the prophet who doesn't see, but
And then Jonathan Peugeot, I think, rightly points out, you have blind prophets, and of course prophets are supposed to be seers, but they're blind, and part of that is sort of, well, they see what we don't see, and they don't see what we do see.
actually sees spiritually. So it's like this
And the need for the need for the
But
storytelling
here's the
intermediary.
opposite, right? He sees God face. He says, I just mentioned Deuteronomy. He sees him face to face, but he's a mumbler. He's a stumbler.
I really appreciated the point that you made yesterday, Jonathan. I think that this idea that Moses is without logos, and I'm not sure how it's translated in the Septuagint.
And now James Orr here at 5736 makes an excellent point, and it's actually the reason that I pulled all this stuff to look at it, because he makes the point that Moses is without logos. And so I looked it up, and in many ways, chapter 6, so chapter 4, you have the introduction, he goes to Israel, you sort of have the whole thing collapse. Chapter 6, Moses goes back to the Lord, and in fact, if you look at Moses, again, his complaint, now it changes. You have chapter 5, you have the bridegroom blood with regard to circumcision. And so when you get to chapter 6 and you sort of rehearse this story again, when you get to 6 verse 12, and this is where the newer and the older translations really sort of fail. So if you look at, let's say, the NIV, but Moses said to the Lord, if the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips? If you look at Tanakh, the 1985 version, but Moses appeared to the Lord, saying, the Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me? I'm a man of impeded speech. But if you look at JPS 1917, the older translations tend to be, they're thinking more along the line of sort of word translations. And so they'll often sort of leave almost wooden translations of the word in, which help keep the symbolic connections between the passages. So in Tanakh 1917, the verse reads, and Moses said before the Lord, behold, the children of Israel have not hearkened unto me. How then shall Pharaoh hear me, who am of uncircumcised lips? And so there you're getting into this whole question, and a little bit later they're going to get into chapter 5 with the story of, where Moses is almost put to death by God, but this whole question of circumcision. Now, circumcision works symbolically. Obviously, there's a physical sign of circumcision, a physical act of circumcision, but there's also a symbolism around it. I'm a man of unclean lips. Circumcision is circumcision of the heart. The Bible will talk about it's a consecration of it, and so that's where. So I looked this up when he had made this point, and I looked in the. It's actually in chapter 6. Ego de alogos eimi. Basically, I'm a logos. I don't. Is sort of the reverse in Greek. So I can't do the logos, which is interesting that the LXX translates uncircumcised lips as I'm without the logos. So it's very, very interesting.
The Greek translation of the third century BC of the Hebrew Scriptures, that Moses is so he's stumbling, he's without speech, but logos, of course, he's without reason, and as it were, he's the perfect vehicle for the divine logos. That was what you were trying to say, I think, right? And he's being prepared not just for divine revelation, but for the specific revelation in the Decalogue.
And it's important to understand the mediation. So the difficulty with mediation is that as you go down the mountain, because as you come down, then there's the problem that things can start going off key right away. Because that's the problem of mediation. It's like on the one hand, it offers the identity down into the particulars, but also then it starts to get wonky.
Sure.
And so
if
Aaron,
you're up on the mountain, someone might make a golden calf while they're down at the bottom.
But that's exactly. But it's Aaron who makes the golden calf.
Right.
It's the one that God establishes as the second tier of. That's right. That's right.
Okay. So what
but
we're
the mediation is starting to. The danger of the mediation is starting to appear.
The Luciferian intellect is supposed to be subordinate to the process that has the divine revelation. That's what it means. And that's what it means. And that's what Ian McGilchrist has said about how the brain should function properly, right? Is that the left hemisphere is the arrogant intellect in the fundamental sense of the word, and it likes to think that what it knows is everything, and properly it should be subordinate to the right, which is inarticulate, but which has it has the ability to look up fundamentally.
Well, so St. Gregory of Nyssa, who I've mentioned a few times in terms of his commentary on this, he goes exactly towards McGilchrist. I don't know if McGilchrist is aware of him, but so he says that Aaron is the helper, and he presents him as the guardian angel. He says, Aaron is like the guardian angel. And each person, like in the cartoons, they have an angel on their right shoulder and a devil on their left shoulder. And both of those are something like their Aaron, the two possibilities of Aaron. So it's like an influence which can pull you in one direction or the other. And you have to be able to see the good helper and be careful of the bad helper.
You know, if you're orienting yourself properly in the world, I would say in relationship to your own intelligence and your own verbal acuity, you want to keep that Luciferian intellect subordinate to the ability to see the burning bush when it manifests itself. And that's why attention...
I think every time Jordan Peterson starts talking about Luciferian intellect, everybody gets nervous because, of course, Lucifer, the devil, but Peterson's point is Lucifer is a light bringer, and Peugeot keeps talking about the mediation, and I think built into Peugeot's point about mediation, you could think about it as the applier's dilemma. You can think about, let's say, the difference between science and engineering. Science sort of gives you what's up here theoretical, and the engineer has to put it into practice. And the difficulty with putting things into practice is that the physical world is still more complex than we can capture, so there are always trade-offs that have to be made. And that's, in some sense, the mediator's dilemma, that the mediator has to make choices, and sometimes they make good choices and sometimes they make bad choices. And I think that's sort of what Peugeot was saying with the two angels on the shoulder.
It should be subordinate to verbal acuity, because you want to be open to the revelation of the divine, because that's what keeps your Luciferian intellect in check. And I would say that's partly why it's reasonable for someone like Dostoevsky and then Solzhenitsyn to say beauty will save the world, because you have a revelation of the divine in the apprehension of beauty, and that has to be translated into the verbal before it's.
And I think that's exactly it, because beauty is sort of we see it's sort of like someone who says, well, my thoughts sounded good in my head, but then when they came out of my mouth, they weren't the same thing. Or when you're trying to see something and draw it, you realize the drawing is more difficult. That's the mediator's dilemma. And so on one hand, yeah, the Lord is rightly frustrated with Moses, saying, I chose you, I've prepared you from the beginning, you're going to be the one to do this. But Moses, to his credit, understands a little bit about what this whole thing is involved. And in a way, picking Aaron, in a sense, okay, well, Aaron will have the mediator's dilemma, more than you will.
Yeah, so attention, definition.
Attention
first, definition
first.
second.
Well, and I would say the heavenly hierarchy, most fundamentally, is the hierarchy of attention. That is what it is.
Is there also not, I mean, what do you make of the fact, Moses is hardly portrayed here as, the hero. God says go. He says, oh, who should I tell them sent me? And then he says, okay, well, listen. He says, well, they won't believe me. He says, okay, well, here's 2 miracles. Oh, but I'm not very eloquent. So, I mean,
we're
here's
back
what's
to the
interesting.
overripe cantaloupe problem a little bit.
Moses is not doubtful that this is God. This is not a matter of, I don't believe this guy. I mean, he knows he's talking to God, and God is telling him to do this, and he's trying to get out of it, right? I mean, clearly, 3 or 4 times, trying to say, no, not me. So what I'm trying to get at is, and then God's going to kill him. And so what I'm trying to ask here is, what does this mean for us? Like, what is, it appears as though
So now we have the question, what does this mean for us? And I love that Stephen Blackwood brings this in here. And again, this is sort of the sermonic. And in some ways, this is the appliers of the word have the mediator's dilemma. And remember what I talked about modernity and correspondence. If you're reading Robert Alter is paying attention to, okay, well, what disease are they actually talking about? And the modern preoccupation is we want a physical correspondence between this. But the sermonic correspondence is much more like patterns. Well, okay, here's the pattern. How can I apply this pattern? How can I enter into this pattern? What is the pattern that I can participate in? And, part of the reason I like doing these commentaries is, I've listened to all of this before, but when I listen to it again, and especially because when I have to talk about it and talk it through, I have to slow down and I have to pay attention to what they're saying and doing. I see more, and I probably hadn't seen fully this whole mediator's dilemma, and in some ways, Stephen Blackwood is going all the way to the bottom because it's the application. What is the application here? And I think I have a better understanding of Moses' complaint. After listening to Peugeot's argument, I say, okay, Moses, you are going to display the power of chaos and order, of staff and snake, of health and disease, of water which is abundant with potential, and spilled blood which is death. And so you can see life and death, order and chaos all through those signs. And again, I think prior to this, again, probably more because of my formation in the modern period, these are miracles. Okay. And so when I had my men's Bible study, I asked them, these are miracles, so what? What do these miracles mean? Well, it means that you have a connection to the gods. That's how the Egyptians would have thought it, that someone is coming with divine power. Someone can wield the power of the gods. And of course, in a pagan society, that's exactly what they're looking to do. They're looking to wield the power of the gods against their enemy. It's the paganism of the Jedi. We're going to wield, the Jedi doesn't sort of submit to the path of the Force. The Jedi wields the Force in order to, and the Sith, they wield the Force in order to achieve what they want. That's always the problem of a system that at the top of the hierarchy has the impersonal, because the personal is always more powerful than the impersonal, because the personal has agency and will and logos and can actually move things towards an end. So the question is, so you've got all this, and Stephen Blackwood basically says, what is the application?
Obedience is also necessary to the revelation.
To the right thing. Yeah.
To the revelation from God.
It's a very common motif mythologically, though, that the hero flees when first confronted with the dragon or the giant or with his responsibility. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that even if you're good, like Moses, and ready in some sense, when push comes to shove, you still might think, I'd rather be like Abraham. Maybe I'd rather be back in the tent eating peeled
grapes. And that's
grapes.
not presented as a virtue here, I don't think.
No. I don't think it is a virtue. I think it's a human failing that's built mercifully into the narrative.
That's Clint Eastwood.
So the point is, I think, again, the developmental point, and they're getting at the developmental point, that Abraham, it is the call of God that develops Abraham into the chosen instrument of God, even though God's choice and calling comes before Abraham is ready to be it. And we see this again with Isaac. We see it especially with Jacob. We see it with Joseph, who, of course, is this bratty kid who has the potential of seeing, but then, of course, he comes full and he becomes he really becomes the magnanimous leader who will not take revenge on his brothers.
Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven, right? It's Kevin Costner at the opening The Bodyguard, right? This is a motif that's everywhere. And part of it goes into, I think, Dennis, you were remarking yesterday that a lot of people who are the leaders who we want, would not be people who want to be leaders, right? That's a trope that's quite old.
They don't want power, for sure.
That's right. And so the fact that Moses is kind of hemming and hawing on the one hand seems like, he's kvetching, right? But on the other hand, there's an aspect that you want somebody who's not saying, great, I'm so glad God spoke to me, I got this, right?
Well, and also,
get behind me, God, here we go.
And isn't the message here that to regular Joes like me, that God can use you, right? I mean, your impediments, your not being articulate, your not being the right I mean, the message here surely has got to be that God's work is brought about by broken vessels, by imperfect people.
Also, maybe even more than that in some sense, is that the brokenness might be a precondition for a kind of revelation that couldn't occur without that particular kind of brokenness.
Yes.
And so, and that touches back.
But again,
at least
remember what he's facing. I mean, my family were friends of Wilberforce, and I'm always amazed at his personal mission statement about slavery, which in his day was an incredible idea. But imagine this. I mean, slavish people and the greatest empire maybe ever.
Right.
I mean, this is incredible.
And no necessary preconception that slavery's in some essential sense wrong. Right? I mean, for us now, one of the revelations here seems to be...
He knows he wants to free his people.
I know, but it's not like the Egyptians necessarily think that what they're doing is wrong.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Now, at least in the world, I would say there's a universal conception.
Divinely right.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And justified by power. So, why wouldn't you justify it by power?
I would have ducked this. I bet most of us would have.
Well, I think most of us do. All the time. And no wonder, right? It's no wonder. And that might be the sin of false humility in some sense.
There's a lovely story of Coleridge, if I may just interject, of where he used to go on holiday on the south coast of England, and sometimes there were cargo from vessels that were shipwrecked, and the locals would look out for these shipwrecks because, of course, of the valuable things they would discover. And apparently Coleridge was observing this one morning on his morning constitutional, and was recorded saying, the providential shipwreck. Maybe I'm a providential shipwreck. And I think that has caused a deep, I mean, from the poet of the Ancient Mariner, but that's a deeply...
It's not such a bad way to conceptualize yourself. And I think when you love someone, you sort of conceptualize themselves that way too, because this is especially true within families, because you're sort of thrown into your family, and so you're sort of with people who are on average like other people, and they have their idiosyncrasies and their weaknesses, but the fact that you love them means that you do regard them as providential shipwrecks. You could replace them with something perfect, but then they wouldn't be the person that you love.
So they're talking about the providential shipwreck, and again, it's the developmental. The Velveteen. Where did we go recently? So we were somewhere, and somebody had put sort of the most important page from the Velveteen Rabbit. This is. I should just read it if you've never read the book, if you don't know anything about it. My preacher in Grand Rapids, Dave Beelan, loved that book and talked about it often. Wow, Bing AI just pulled the sucker right up. The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams Bianco is a beloved children's book that has inspired many readers. Here's a few quotes from the book. These are, of course, probably the most quoted quotes. "Real isn't how you're made," said the skin horse. "It's the thing that happens to you when a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you. Then you become real. Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked, "or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the skin horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily or have sharp edges or have to be carefully kept. It doesn't happen to people in safe spaces. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because you are real. Because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. Once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." He didn't mind how he looked to other people because the nursery magic had made him real, and when you are real, shabbiness doesn't matter.
Stephen's term, everyone's a broken vessel, right? And the break is the point at which, the break, the flaws are the point at which, we were talking about this a little bit, the conversation yesterday about excising versus integrating. Remember that when we were discussing that? And part of the integration is that the parts of us that are broken should always be there and broken. That's the gift against which you hurl the other parts of yourself against to grow them larger. It's not that you eliminate it, right? It's not that you repress it. And so all those broken aspects of it, and the broken vessel is, it's the God-given or evolutionarily selected, depending on which way you come from it, gift that gives you the thing against which to hone yourself.
I'm just mesmerized. I am sorry. I stopped at providential shipwreck. And I was thinking, when I called my wife tonight, honey, you are my providential shipwreck.
Yeah.
Let us know how it goes.
I will let you know how it goes. And as well as I know her, I'm not sure how she will react.
I'm
just
sensing
for the
a new line of Douglas Hallmark cards.
Well, Providence may have a shipwreck in your future.
And thou shalt.
So as we've done, we'll stop there, and I'll just play the whole thing. I'm probably going to keep the files, and so if I have to edit it, I just don't know that it holds together well without all of the content in the middle. So I'm not sure what I'll do. We'll play with it and take it as it comes and see what Daily Wire wants to do. So yeah, we'll talk about mediatorship. That's sort of a good theme for this section.